The cold up here did not whisper. It hunted. It came down off the high ridges with teeth, and it had taken men twice her size, men who knew the land, men who laughed at girls who didn't. So when the town below sealed its doors and waited for the worst winter in living memory, every voice that mattered agreed on one thing. The girl on the mountain would not last the week. She was 18. She had no family, no money, and no business being there at all, just a crumbling ruin of stone, a single cardboard suitcase, and a name on a deed that belonged to a woman dead long before she was born. They expected to find her frozen by the first snow. A sad story, a lesson. What none of them knew was that buried deep in the wreckage of that ruin, sealed in tin and wax against 100 winters, something had been waiting for someone desperate enough to dig, someone with nothing left to lose. And on the third night of the storm, while the richest house in the valley went dark and silent and cold, one small light stayed burning on the mountain. The wind screamed at her door. She did not answer. She had work to do. The last place that had ever been forced to keep her did not say goodbye. It simply opened its door, let the cold air rush in past her ankles, and waited for her to step through it and out of its life forever. A girl stood on the worn stone steps, 18 years old, holding everything she owned in two hands that had never once held anything worth keeping. A single suitcase, its corners gone soft with age, a thin envelope, and a folded square of paper so brittle it seemed it might crumble to dust if she breathed on it wrong. Behind her, the building loomed, gray, tired, the kind of place that had housed a great many children over the years, and had never, not once, learned to love a single one of them. It had been her shelter. It had never been her home. There is a difference between those two words. She had learned it early, the way children in places like that learn everything, without being taught, and without being spared. The man who ran the place had handed her the envelope the way a person hands over something they are relieved to finally be rid of. There had been no warmth in it, no word that might have stayed with her on the long road ahead. Just the dry rustle of paper and the small click of the door behind her. Inside the envelope, a little money, enough for a week perhaps, less if she was anything but careful. And the folded paper was a deed, an inheritance. The word should have meant something good. It should have felt like a door swinging open somewhere instead of one more door closing behind her. It did not feel like that at all, because the man had looked at the paper and at her and let his mouth twist into a shape that was almost a smile, and entirely without kindness. A ruin on a rock, he had said, up north, belonged to some old woman who died out there alone. He had let the words hang in the cold air a moment. Fitting, I'd say. He did not explain what he meant. He did not need to. She had understood him perfectly. The cast-off girl, receiving the cast-off land. A worthless thing handed down to a worthless thing. And then the door had closed. The latch had fallen with a small, final sound, and she stood alone beneath a sky so wide and so indifferent that it did not seem to notice her at all. She was at last exactly what they had always told her she was. No one's problem. She stood there longer than she meant to. A part of her, some stubborn animal part, kept waiting for the door to open again. For someone to come out and say there had been a mistake, that she was wanted somewhere after all, No one came. They never had. So she picked up the suitcase and she turned her back on the only walls she had ever known, and she walked toward the road that would carry her north. The road north was a slow unmaking of everything she had ever known. The land changed as she traveled, mile after mile, and every change took something familiar away with it and gave nothing back. The soft, ordinary green of the lowlands thinned and faded into gray. The gray hardened into brown. The trees grew shorter, then meaner. Then they began to bend, all of them, in the same direction, leaning away from a wind she could not yet see but could already feel pressing its cold hands against the glass. The other travelers did not look at her, or they looked once and decided in that single glance that she was nothing worth a second, and turned back to their own lives. A worn coat, one small bag, a girl traveling alone, and everyone knows what a girl traveling alone really is. She is a girl with no one waiting at the other end, a girl no one is coming to meet. There was a woman across the aisle once for part of the way, an older woman with a basket on her lap and a kind, careworn face, who looked at the girl twice instead of once, and seemed, for a moment, on the edge of saying something, a word, an offering. The girl saw it coming and looked down at her own hands, because she had learned long ago what to do with kindness that was only passing through. You did not reach for it. You did not let yourself want it, because it always, always got off at the next stop. The woman got off at the next stop, and the girl was alone again, and it was easier that way. It hurt less to expect nothing. So she said nothing to anyone. She watched the world grow thin and hard through the window, and she let it. And somewhere along that lonely road, the wind began to speak, not gently. The wind in that high country did not whisper to anyone, ever. It scraped at the windows like something with claws. It pushed at the walls. It made a low, constant guttural sound that was not really weather at all, but something closer to a warning. A voice that had been saying the same thing to this land for 1,000 years. You do not belong here. None of you ever did. By the time she finally stepped down at the last stop on the line, the wind was waiting for her. It came at her at once, as if it had heard she was coming and had been holding its breath. It tore at her hair. It found every gap and seam in her thin coat. It tasted the small warmth of her and seemed to draw back and consider and decide that it did not approve. The town was small, smaller than she had let herself imagine. A single street of weather-beaten buildings, leaning close together the way people lean close when they are cold and trying their best not to show it. There was a store with a faded front, a handful of houses, a church no bigger than a barn, and behind it all rose the mountains, enormous, pale, patient. They stood up against the sky like something that had been there before the town, and would be there long after it was gone and forgotten. She did not stop. She did not have the money to stop, and she did not have anyone to stop for. The directions on the back of the deed sent her walking out past the edge of it all, 5 miles, on foot, with the suitcase growing heavier in her hand with every step. The road gave up its pavement first, then its gravel, then, at last, it gave up the very idea of being a road and became nothing more than a thin, pale scar winding up through the rock and the stunted, wind-bitten pines. She walked. There was nothing else to do but walk. The cold worked its way into her boots. Her breath came out in pale clouds and was snatched away. Her arm went numb from the weight of the case, and she switched it to the other hand, and then back again, and then she stopped counting. The light began to lower and lengthen and turn the color of old gold. And when at last she came over the final rise and saw what she had been given, a small sound escaped her throat, strangled, hopeless, a sound she had not known she could make, because the word ruin had been far too kind. It was a skeleton. What was left of the little stone house clung to the spine of the ridge above a vast and empty canyon, as though even the building itself had once tried to leave, and had simply run out of strength halfway through the attempt. The roof had fallen in. Its timbers lay splayed open against the gray sky, gaunt and bare, like the ribs of some enormous animal that had lain down here long ago to die and had never been mourned by anyone. The walls were broken. Whole sections of stone had come loose and crumbled and tumbled away, leaving gaps like missing teeth in a hard old mouth. And through every empty window socket, the wind sang. It was not a song of welcome. It was the mournful, hollow sound a place makes when it has been alone so long it has forgotten that anyone might ever come back. She pushed past what remained of the door. It hung crooked on a single rusted hinge, and it gave way with a low groan that sounded almost like protest. Inside was wreckage. Weeds had grown up between the stones of the floor, dry and gray now in the cold. The fallen roof beams lay where they had landed, rotted soft. And against one wall stood a great stone hearth, black with the soot of 1,000 fires that no one would ever light again, split straight down its center by a crack as wide as her open hand. She set the suitcase down in the dust, and then she simply stopped, because all of it came down on her at once, not the cold, not the wind, something far heavier than either, the loneliness, the complete, bottomless, untethered solitude of a girl standing in the ruins of a dead stranger's house, at the end of a road, at the edge of the known world, with no one behind her, and no one ahead, and nothing in her hands but a suitcase, and a deed to a grave. She had nothing. She was nothing. That is what the broken house seemed to whisper to her, through all its empty windows. And for 3 days, she believed it. For 3 days, she did almost nothing at all. She sat on a flat stone just outside the broken walls, wrapped in a blanket too thin for that country. And she watched the pale sun crawl its low, weak arc across the sky and slip away again behind the mountains. She was not thinking. Thinking requires a future to think toward, and she could not find one. Every path she tried to imagine ended at the same gray wall. People imagine despair as something loud. They picture weeping, screaming, a person undone. But the deepest kind of despair has no voice at all. It is a great heaviness that settles over every limb until even standing up feels like more than a person can ask of herself. Giving up did not feel like a choice she was making. It felt like the slow, natural settling of a stone down through still water, like sinking, almost like rest. On the second night, she very nearly walked back down. She got as far as picking up the suitcase. She stood in the broken doorway with it in her hand, and she looked back down the dark line of the road toward the town, toward the bus, toward going somewhere, anywhere. back to the kind of small gray nowhere that at least would not kill her by the first snow, but there was nowhere to go back to. That was the thing. There was no door anywhere in all the world that would open for her if she knocked. She had only the road, and the cold, and this. She set the suitcase back down, and the cold crept deeper into her with each passing hour. And in some distant, uncaring corner of her mind, she understood that the blanket would not be enough, that when the real winter came, it would not be enough at all. And the real winter was coming. She could feel it gathering in the air. Something patient, something old, something that had taken bigger and stronger and far less lonely people than her, and would not so much as pause over the taking of one more. On the fourth morning, something in her shifted. It did not lift. Let no one ever tell you it lifted, because that is not how these things truly go. The despair did not burn off like morning fog in a kind sun. It curdled, it turned, it became something else. She was staring at a loose shutter, at the wind whipping it back and forth in a mad and mocking rhythm. Bang, bang, bang. When she felt the first hot spark of it move through the cold gray fog inside her chest. Anger. A hard, jagged stone of it, settling in beneath her ribs and refusing to be moved. Anger at the man and his almost smile and his single, careful word. Fitting. Anger at every door that had ever shut behind her. Anger at a whole wide world that had looked at a girl with no one to love her and decided, without once asking her opinion, that the most fitting thing she could possibly do was lie down quietly in a pile of broken rock and disappear. She was so tired, not of the cold, not even of the loneliness. She was tired of being the sad story, the cautionary tale, the lesson other people pointed to so their own children would feel grateful for the warm beds they slept in. And it was just then, as the anger rose hot in her chest for the first time in days, that her eyes fell on something at the base of the crumbling wall, a small flicker of color where there should have been none at all. It was a single wildflower, small, stubborn, purple as a fresh bruise against the gray and the brown. It had no earthly business growing there, in that thin and bitter soil, in that killing wind that took down grown men twice its size, but somehow it had pushed itself up through a crack between two stones, and it was not merely surviving in that hard place. It was blooming. Its little head bowed low under the weight of the gale, but its roots held fast. It bent. It did not break. She stared at it for a long, long time, and something inside her went very quiet and very still. Because here was a living thing smaller than her own thumb, with no shelter and no help, and no good reason in all the world to be alive. And it had looked at the same wind and the same cold and the same impossible odds that had crushed her flat for 3 whole days. And it had decided to bloom anyway. If a thing so small could fight, then surely she could. She did not decide it with grand words or solemn promises. She decided it the way a person decides to take the next breath, without permission from anyone, without ceremony, simply because the alternative was to stop, and something in her, at last, refused to stop. She stood up. Her body had stiffened through in the cold, and her muscles cried out in protest, and she let them cry. She walked back through the broken doorway into the wreckage of the little stone house, and she looked at the chaos of it all, and she made the smallest, fiercest decision of her short and unwanted life. She could not fix this place. She knew that with perfect clarity. She had no money, no proper tools, no skill in her hands, and no living soul to teach her. But she could clean it. She could take a small piece of this chaos and impose one stubborn, defiant order upon it. It would not save her. It would not feed her or warm her, but it would be hers. A thing she had chosen with her own two hands in a life where almost nothing had ever once been hers to choose. And more than anything else, it was a way of saying into a wind that did not care to listen, I am still here. I have not gone yet. She began with the smallest things, because the smallest things were the only things she could lift. She dragged the broken timbers out into the cold, one at a time, and stacked them against the one wall that took the least of the wind. She gathered the fallen stones one by one and carried them to a corner and piled them as neatly as her aching arms would allow. The work was hard in a way she had never before known work could be hard. It began in her shoulders and spread down through her back and out into her hands, and after the first hour her whole body sang one long, low note of pain. But something strange and unexpected happened as she worked. The frantic, circling noise in her mind grew quiet. The despair could not find room to speak when every part of her was given over to lifting and carrying and breathing hard. There was no past. There was no terrible future. There was only the next stone, the next beam, the next small square of floor swept clean of weeds and dust. Her hands grew raw. The cold split the skin across her knuckles. The rough stone scraped her palms until they stung. And still she kept going, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant sinking, and she had only just clawed her way up out of that water. And as she cleared the floor, as her bare hands brushed against the walls that someone, long ago, had built with such care, she felt something she had never expected to feel in that lonely place. A connection. Someone had laid these stones. Someone had chosen each one and fitted against the next, with patience, with intention, building a home in a place where the wind itself said no home should ever stand. This was not just a ruin. It was a history. And it was, however poor and broken a thing it might be, hers. The first thing that had ever truly been hers. The hardest part of all was the hearth. The great stone fireplace dominated one wall, and it had taken the very worst of the collapse. It was choked from end to end with fallen chimney stones and crumbled mortar and the fine black soot of every fire that had ever burned within it. The largest stones she could not move. So she dug around them instead. She knelt down in the cold ash and pulled the debris out with her bare hands, piece by piece by piece, and the black dust rose up around her in clouds and settled on her skin and filled her lungs until she had to stop and cough it out again. Her fingers bled. She tore strips from the hem of her blanket and wrapped them, and she kept on digging. She was no longer thinking about why. Clearing the hearth would not warm her. It would not save her life. But she had started, and the starting itself had become the only thing holding back the cold gray fog. And so she dug, deeper than the fallen stones, down toward the old foundation, where the soot was packed as hard and tight as the rock itself. And there, far down, Her bleeding fingers struck something that was not stone. She went still. She brushed the black dust away slowly now, very slowly. Her breath caught somewhere high in her chest. It was metal, flat, heavy. The edges sealed all around with something waxy and old. The way a person seals a thing they mean to last. A box. It had not fallen there by accident. No collapse on earth drops a sealed tin box deep into the foundation of a hearth. It had been placed there, hidden with great care in the warmest heart of the house, set down with intention, deep where the heat would have been, where someone would only ever find it if they dug, if they were desperate enough and stubborn enough to dig all the way down. She sat back on her heels in the cold ash, this girl who had been given nothing her whole life long, holding in her ruined hands a thing that someone, somewhere, had clearly meant for her to find. Her hands were shaking, and this time it was not from the cold. She worked her bleeding fingers beneath the lid, and she pried. The old wax cracked. The seal gave way with a long, soft sigh, the sound of air that had been held longer than she had been alive. And inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, kept perfect and dry against 100 hard winters, was a book, a journal, thick, bound in worn leather, the cover gone smooth under the touch of hands that were not her own. She lifted it out as though it might come apart in her grip, and she opened it, and there, edge to edge across every page, ran a steady and elegant hand. The ink had faded to a soft brown over the years, but every single word was clear. The writing of a woman named Greta Vance, the great-grandmother she had never once met, the old woman who had died out here alone on this rock, the one whose dying had become, by some quiet and unfathomable trick of fate, the only reason the girl stood here at all. She had expected a diary, if she had expected anything. The lonely thoughts of a lonely woman, complaints against the weather, the small, sad record of a life lived too far from anyone. It was nothing of the kind. The very first pages were full of drawings, careful, exact diagrams, drawn by a hand that had clearly drawn 10,000 of them before, lines and angles and numbers, measurements set down with confidence, calculations crowding into every margin like they could not be contained. This was not the diary of a lonely woman at all. This was the working notebook of a builder, an engineer. The girl turned the pages slowly, and the wind was forgotten, and the cold was forgotten, and even the deep ache in her ruined hands was forgotten. And as she read, a picture of the woman who had written it began to take shape before her, line by patient line. A woman who had come from somewhere far away, long ago, carrying a kind of knowledge that the modern world had decided in its hurry was old-fashioned and quaint and useless. A woman who had looked out at this brutal, killing land and had not seen an enemy at all. The land here is not cruel, Greta had written in one clear line near the front. It is only honest. It will never lie to you about what it is. Most people cannot bear that much honesty, and so they call the land cruel, and they fight it with everything they have, and they lose. The girl read it twice, and then a third time. Greta had written, page after page, about the ridge itself, about the deep shelf of granite that ran beneath it, which she described not as mere rock, but as a kind of vast and patient battery. All through the long summer, she wrote, The stone drank in the heat of the sun. Deep down, far below where the frost could ever hope to reach, that warmth was held safe and waiting. The earth remembers the summer, Greta had written in one margin, the letters small and certain and unhurried. We have only to build a house that knows how to listen to it. The girl ran her thumb very gently across the faded words. A house that knows how to listen. She had never in her life heard anything like it. It sounded, on its face, like the words of a woman who had spent far too many winters alone, with nothing but the wind for company. The kind of thing the man at the orphanage would have curled his lip at. But there were the diagrams, page after page after page of them, cold, exact, built of numbers that did not sound like the ravings of anyone at all. So she kept reading. The very heart of the journal, the great work that Greta had clearly given her final years to, was a design. She called it by an old word, a word brought over from her old country, and beneath it she had written a plainer name. A stove, but not the small iron box stove the girl knew from the cold halls of the orphanage. Not the kind that ate wood greedily all day long and gave back only a thin and grudging heat. This was something else entirely, a great structure of stone and brick, massive, intricate as a puzzle, built around a small firebox meant to burn just a little fuel, very hot and very fast, and then to close. And here lay the strange and quiet genius of it. The heat would not go racing up the chimney and out into the freezing night, the way it did in every other house. It would be turned instead through a long, winding maze of stone, around and around and around, while the stone itself drank that heat in and held it close. And then, for a full day and a long night after the fire had gone cold and dark, the stone would breathe that gathered warmth slowly back into the room, steady, patient, tireless. It is a stone lung, Greta had written. It takes one deep breath of fire, and it exhales warmth into the house until the morning comes. The girl realized her own breath had gone shallow, but it was the next part that set her heart to pounding. The stove, she understood now, was only ever half of it. The other half was the house itself. Greta had never meant to live in the little stone cottage at all. The cottage, the girl now saw clearly, had only ever been a beginning, a first rough shelter, a place to sleep, while the real and patient work was done. The true house was meant to be dug, cut down into the south-facing side of the ridge, into the body of the earth itself, so that the ground would wrap around it on three sides like a pair of cupped and sheltering hands. The earth would hold the warmth in close, the granite would store it deep, and the stone lung would breathe through the whole long dark of winter. There was more still. Greta's notes spoke of a narrow fissure in the rock, deep within the ridge, from which a faint and steady current of mild air seeped up out of the ground. Not cold, not warm, just steady. The slow, ancient breath of the earth. The plan was to build the house around it, to let the mountain do the work that no furnace and no fortune on earth could ever do. They will tell you it cannot be done, Greta had written near the very end, and the girl felt those words land somewhere deep in her chest, as if they had been written for this exact morning, for this exact girl, kneeling in the cold ash with bleeding hands and nowhere left to go. They will tell you that the cold cannot be reasoned with, that you must fight it and burn everything you own and pray. Do not listen to them. The loud ones are so very sure of themselves, and they are wrong. They will freeze in their loud, proud houses, certain to the very last breath that they were right. Build quiet. Build close to the earth. Build a house that knows how to listen. And the winter will pass you by like a stranger who does not even know your name. The girl sat very still for a long time after that. The wind howled somewhere far above her, through the empty windows of a house that had only ever been the beginning of something far greater. The light coming through the broken gaps had gone gold, and then low, and she had not felt a single one of those hours pass. She looked down at the journal cradled in her ruined hands. She thought of the man at the orphanage and his careful, cruel little smile. Fitting. She thought of the wildflower that had no business living, and had chosen to live, and to bloom, against all of it. And she thought of a woman she had never met, dead and gone long before the girl was ever born, who had spent the last years of her life filling a book with everything she knew, and then sealed it in tin and wax, and buried it deep in the very heart of a cold hearth, where only the truly desperate would ever think to dig. Greta had not left her a ruin. The world had only called it a ruin. What Greta had truly left her was a key, and the girl understood then, all at once, with a certainty she had never once felt about anything in all her short and unwanted life, exactly what she was going to do. She was not going to fix the little stone cottage. The cottage had never been the point. She was going to finish what the old woman had started. She was going to build the house out of the mountain itself. She closed the journal and held it tight against her chest. And for the first time since the door of her childhood had shut behind her with that small, final click, she did not feel alone. Not because anyone had come. No one had come. No one was ever going to come. And she had made her hard peace with that days ago, sitting on a cold stone, watching the sun give up. But there is a difference, a great and quiet difference between being alone and being abandoned. A stranger, long dead, had once thought of her, had reached across all those silent years to set something down in the dark, where one desperate girl might one day find it, had believed, without ever knowing her face or her name, that somewhere down the long line of years there would come someone stubborn enough and angry enough and unwilling enough to lie down and quietly die, to dig all the way to the bottom. She was that someone. She did not know if it would be enough. She did not know whether a girl with no skill and a borrowed week of money and a winter bearing down on her could truly build a house out of a mountain before the cold came to collect what everyone had already promised it. The odds said no. Everything around her said no. But the small purple wildflower at the base of the broken wall said something else entirely. She rose to her feet in the failing light. Her hands were ruined. Her back was a single line of fire. She was hungry in a way she had long since stopped letting herself notice. She looked out through the broken doorway, past the splayed gray ribs of the fallen roof, to the south-facing slope of the ridge, where the earth lay waiting to be opened. The wind struck her full in the face, cold, and full of its old warning. She did not flinch from it now. "All right," she said, quietly, to the wind and to the mountain, and to a woman who had been gone from the world far longer than the girl had been in it. Just that. 2 small words, very nearly lost in the gale. But she meant them, all the way down to the bottom. And far below her, in a small town that had already decided exactly how her story was going to end, not one single soul knew that, high on a windswept ridge, at the very edge of the world, a girl with nothing left in all the world to lose had just decided to begin. The decision was easy. The work was not. Because deciding to build a house out of a mountain and actually building one are 2 different things. And the distance between them is measured in blood. She woke on the 5th morning to a sky the color of slate, and she did not wait for it to warm, because it would not. She wrapped her ruined hands in fresh strips of blanket. She propped the journal open against a stone where she could see it, and she walked out to the south-facing slope of the ridge where the earth lay waiting to be opened. And she began to dig. She had no proper tools, not yet. So she dug with what the ruin had left her. A flat shard of broken metal she used as a kind of crude trowel. A length of fallen roof timber she used as a lever, the way the old woman's diagrams had shown her, to roll aside stones far too heavy for any girl to lift. The ground did not want to be opened. It had been packed hard by 100 winters, and it fought her for every inch. The metal shard bit into the earth and skipped off the rock beneath. The timber bowed under her weight and very nearly snapped. By midday she had cleared a space no larger than a grave. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked away, because the thought was too close to the bone. And she went back to digging. This was a new kind of brutal. In those first days of clearing the cottage, she had only been moving what was already broken, lifting, carrying, setting things in order. But this was carving. She was not tidying a ruin anymore. She was shaping a world. Pulling a home up out of the raw body of the mountain with nothing but her own 2 hands and an old woman's dream. The labor reached parts of her she had not known a person could feel. It started deep in her back and ran down through her legs and out into hands that had long since stopped being soft. She ate the last of the food from the thin envelope. Then she ate the hard wild berries she found growing in sparse, stubborn clumps along the slope, the ones the birds had not yet taken. They were sour. They were not enough. She ate them anyway. Her days fell into a rhythm. Wake in the gray. Dig until her arms gave out. Eat what little there was. Read the journal by the last of the light. And then fall into a sleep so deep and so dreamless, it was less like rest and more like being switched off at the wall. And each morning she woke feeling as though she had been beaten in the night. But she also woke, changed. Her hands, once soft, began to harden. The blisters rose and broke, and the skin beneath grew tough as old leather. The soft edges of her, the parts that had been a child only weeks before, began to wear away, and underneath them she found something else, something lean, something wiry, something that did not break. She was becoming, slowly and against her will, as hard and as enduring as the land that had been trying to kill her. In the long evenings, when her arms were too spent to lift another stone, she read. And the more she read, the more the woman behind the diagrams came alive for her. Because Greta had not only set down numbers and angles, here and there between the calculations, she had let herself speak. And in those passages, the girl found something she had not been looking for and had not known she needed. A life that rhymed with her own. Greta, too, had come here alone. Greta, too, had stood once on this ridge with everything she owned in one hand and no one in all the world waiting at her back. She had crossed an ocean as a young woman, the journal said, from a country with another name, and she had buried a husband somewhere along the way, and she had arrived at the end of every road with empty pockets and a head full of things nobody around her believed in. They laughed at me, Greta had written, in a passage the girl read over and over by the failing light. A woman, alone, talking of stone and heat and the breath of the earth. They thought me mad. Perhaps I was, a little. You have to be a little mad to build a thing the whole world swears cannot stand. I built it anyway, and I was warm, while the ones who laughed were cold. The girl pressed her palm flat against the page, as though she could feel through the paper the warmth of a hand that had been gone from the world for longer than she had been in it. She was not the first cast off to come to this rock with nothing. She was only the next. And that, somehow, made all the difference. Because it meant the thing she was attempting was not impossible. A woman had done it before her. A woman as alone as she was. The proof of it was in the very stones around her, and in the book in her lap, and in the faint, patient breath of the fissure in the rock. She read until the candle guttered, and then she slept and dreamed of nothing, and woke and dug. It was in the third week of digging that she first heard the old woman's voice. Not truly. She was not a girl who heard voices, and she knew the difference. But there are kinds of company that do not require a living person. She had hit a layer of rock she could not move. A great flat shelf of granite, right where the journal said the back wall of the house should be. She had thrown her whole weight against it. She had wedged the timber beneath it and pushed until something in her shoulder screamed. And it had not moved at all. She sat down hard in the dirt, and the cold gray fog began, just a little, to roll back in. So she opened the journal, the way she did when the digging stopped making sense, the way another girl might have called a mother. And there, near the middle, in that steady, unhurried hand, she found it. "You will reach the great stone," Greta had written. "Every builder does. It is not in your way. It is your back wall, waiting for you. Do not fight the mountain for it. The mountain has been here longer than fighting. Build to it. Build against it. Let it hold what you cannot." The girl read it twice. And then she did something she had not done since the day the last door closed behind her. She laughed. It was a small sound and rough, and it surprised her coming out. But it was real, because the old woman had known. Sitting in this same dirt, fighting this same stone, some long ago year, Greta had set down her own tools and understood that the rock was not an enemy. It was the foundation. The girl stopped trying to move the great stone after that. She began to build toward it instead. And the work, somehow, went faster. The man came on a morning when the frost had not yet melted off the grass. She heard the horse before she saw him, the slow, heavy fall of hooves on rock. And then he came over the rise, tall and broad in a thick wool coat, a wide-brimmed hat throwing his face into shadow. He sat his horse and looked down at her for a long moment before he said a word. He looked at the ruin, at the growing pile of earth she had hauled from the slope, at the girl herself, thin and filthy, and leaning on a length of timber, her hands wrapped in rags. and something settled over his features that was almost worse than cruelty. Pity. "Royce Hartwell," he said at last, as though the name alone should mean something to her, as though it meant a great deal to everyone else. "I own most of what you can see from up here." He let his gaze travel slowly over her work. "You'd be the girl then, the one squatting on the dead woman's rock." She did not look away from him. "Marin," she said. Just that. Her own name, spoken plainly. The first time she had said it aloud to another living person in longer than she could remember. Marin Cole. He did not ask what she was doing. He simply waited, with the patience of a man used to being explained to. So she told him. She told him about the stove of stone and brick that would breathe warmth for a day from a single fire. She told him about the house dug into the ridge, wrapped in earth, warmed by the granite and the slow breath of the mountain. She spoke with a bright, earnest conviction of someone who had read a thing and believed it with her whole heart. She should not have, because as she spoke, the pity in his face curdled into something else. First disbelief, then open amusement. And by the time she finished, he was shaking his head and laughing a short, hard laugh that had no warmth in it at all. "A stone lung," he repeated. "The earth remembers the summer." He said the words back to her the way you repeat the babble of a child. "Girl, that's the talk of a crazy old woman. And you're a bigger fool than I took you for, believing it." He swept one thick arm out across the land. "This country doesn't remember anything but the cold. It's a killer. It's killed better than you." He leaned down over the neck of his horse. "There's a winter coming. The worst this country has known in longer than the old-timers care to count. You need 4 cord of good dry wood and a real iron stove just to have a prayer." His voice dropped, and for one moment it almost sounded like kindness. "What you've got here is a hole in the ground, and you're digging it yourself." He straightened. "You'll be a frozen thing by first snow. Mark me. Go back where you came from, while there's still a road to take you." His certainty was absolute. It was the certainty of a man who had never once in his life been wrong about anything that mattered, because he had always had enough money and enough land to make sure of it, and that certainty should have broken her. A girl with nothing, told by a man with everything that she was going to die. It should have sent her down the mountain that same afternoon, suitcase in hand, back toward the gray building and the closed door. But here is the strange thing about a heart that has already been told it is worthless so many times by so many people. It learns to burn the insult as fuel. His scorn did not crush the small fire in her chest. It poured oil on it. She looked up at him, this man on his fine horse, so sure of her ending, and she felt the jagged stone of anger settle in beneath her ribs, harder than ever, and turn slowly into something colder and far more useful. Resolve. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. It came out of her as solid and as settled as the great stone she had stopped trying to move. Hartwell looked at her a moment longer. Then he scoffed and shook his head as a man shakes his head over something already lost, and turned his horse. He rode away without another word. He had come up that ridge to break her. He left, having done the opposite. He had taken her resolve, which was a soft and uncertain thing, and hammered it into something hard and bright and unbreakable, the way heat and a hammer make steel. She watched him go, and then she picked up her timber and went back to the wall. But a man like that does not simply ride away and forget. Word in that country traveled faster than any horse. It went from saddle to porch, from porch to store, from store to supper table. And the word that traveled now, in Royce Hartwell's own certain voice, was that there was a half-mad girl up on the dead woman's rock, digging herself a grave, talking the same crazy talk that had killed the old woman before her. She did not hear it. Not at first. She heard it only when the food ran out completely. The berries were gone. The last of the envelope was long spent, and a body cannot dig a house out of a mountain on nothing. Her hands had grown strong, but her cheeks had grown hollow, and there came a morning when she stood up too fast and the world went gray at the edges, and she had to catch herself against the cold stone. She knew then that she could not put it off. She would have to go down, into the town, into the human world that Royce Hartwell so plainly ruled. She washed the worst of the dirt from her face in the cold creek. She put on her one coat, and she walked the 5 miles down the mountain, her stomach a hollow knot, her heart a tighter one. The town did not welcome her. She felt it the moment her boots touched the single frozen street. A curtain shifted in a window and fell still. 2 women on a porch stopped their talk and watched her pass, and did not nod, and turned to each other only after she had gone by. A man loading his wagon looked up, took her in. The ruined hands, the hollow cheeks, the girl Hartwell had been talking about, and looked deliberately away, as though meeting her eye might be catching. She was the crazy one from the rock, the one who would be dead by spring. People do not like to look too long at a thing they have already decided is doomed. It sits too close to a question they would rather not ask about themselves. She kept her chin level and walked the length of the street as though their stares weighed nothing. They weighed a great deal, but she had carried heavier. The store smelled of sawdust and old coffee and cured leather. It was dim inside and cluttered, every shelf crowded with the small necessary things of hard lives. Behind the counter stood an older man with a tired, kind face and hands dusted pale with flour. He looked up when the door opened, and she saw, in the half-second before he hit it, that he already knew exactly who she was. The word had reached here too. "Amos," he said, by way of giving her his name, since she had not asked. He set down the jar he had been wiping. "You'd be the one up on the ridge." She braced for it, for the laugh, for the curl of the lip, for fitting. "Hartwell says you're trying to live in a hole in the ground," Amos went on. "Says the winter's going to take you, same as it took the old woman." She lifted her chin. "It might," she said, and something in the plainness of it, in the way she did not argue and did not flinch, made the old man go quiet and study her properly for the first time. He looked at her hands, the ruined knuckles, the leather palms that no girl her age should have had. He looked at the hollow of her cheeks and the exhaustion carved into her face, and the way her jaw was set against all of it. "He's probably right," Amos admitted at last, picking up the jar again, turning it slowly in the cloth. "Common sense says he's right." He paused. He looked out the window, up toward the high, lonely ridge, just visible through the dust on the glass. "But common sense never built these mountains." She laid the last of her money on the counter. It was a small and humiliating pile. A few coins. Everything she had left in all the world. "This is all I have," she said. The words cost her more than the coins did. She needed so much more than they could buy. Fire bricks for the heart of the stove, the special clay-fired kind that could take a flame without cracking. A sack of flour, salted meat to last her, real tools, a shovel and a pick that were not broken pieces of a dead house. Amos looked at the little pile of coins. Then he looked back up at her, and he pushed the money across the counter back toward her hand. "Keep it," he said. His voice had gone gruff, the way some men's voices go when they are doing a kind thing and do not want to be caught at it. "You'll need it before the spring." She stared at him. "I'll run you a line," he said. "Take what you need. Pay me when the snow goes." He met her eyes, steady. "If you're still here to pay it." It was not faith. She understood that, even then. He did not believe she would live. No one did. But it was not pity either. It was something rarer. It was a man looking at a girl everyone had written off, and deciding, against all the common sense in the world, to give her a chance to be wrong about her own ending. It was the first crack in the wall of her solitude. A hand held out, not soft, not warm, but open. She took it. And as she gathered her supplies into a borrowed sack, Amos spoke once more, without looking up from the ledger where he was writing down what she owed. "I knew her," he said. "A little. The old woman. Years back." Marin went still. "Everyone called her cracked," Amos said. "Talk to the rocks," they said. "Wouldn't burn proper firewood." He shook his head slowly. "But I'll tell you a thing nobody else'll tell you. The winter the river froze solid. The winter we lost 2 families down the valley to the cold." He tapped the pencil once against the counter. "That old woman walked into this store in the spring, thin but fine. Fine as you please, like the winter had passed her right by." He looked up at last. "I never did understand it," he said. "Maybe you will." It was the most anyone in that whole hard country had given her. Not money, not even kindness, exactly. A reason to believe she was not mad. She carried it back up the mountain heavier than the sack on her shoulder, and lighter than she had come down. With proper tools, the work changed. Amos had sold her a real shovel, its blade bright and sharp, and a pick that bit into the hard ground like it had been waiting all its life to. He had sold her a wheelbarrow with a wheel that wobbled and squeaked, but turned, and that single squeaking wheel saved her 1,000 aching trips. The digging did not get easier, but it got faster. She found the room the journal had promised. A space 10 feet by 12, cut down into the south slope, with the great granite shelf forming the whole back wall, just as Greta had drawn it. And then she found the thing she had almost not let herself believe in. The fissure. A narrow crack in the granite, exactly where the old woman's diagram said it would be, after all these years. She put her bleeding hand up to it in the cold dark of the half-dug room, and she felt it. A breath. A faint, steady current of air slipping up out of the deep heart of the mountain. Not cold, not warm, just there, patient, alive in the way old stone is alive. The slow breath of the earth, exactly as Greta had written it. She knelt down in the dirt before that crack in the rock, and for a long moment she could not speak at all. Because the old woman had been right about the granite, about the summer the stone remembered, about all of it, which meant she might be right about the rest. It was around then that Royce Hartwell came back. She heard the horse again, that same heavy tread, and she came up out of the half-dug room with dirt to her elbows and met him standing, the shovel in her hand, like a thing she might need. He did not get down this time. "You're still here," he said. There was something new in his voice, not amusement now, something closer to irritation. A man does not like to be proven slow to be right. "I am," she said. He looked past her at the work, at how much of the slope she had opened, at the walls beginning to rise out of the earth, fitted close and true. And she saw across his face the smallest flicker of a thing he did not want to feel. That this was not the flailing of a doomed child, that something here was being built. He covered it fast. "I'll make you an offer," he said. "More than this rock is worth. More than that dead woman left you. Enough to start clean somewhere a person can actually live." He named a sum. It was, to a girl with nothing, an enormous amount of money. "You take it, you walk down off this mountain, and you live to see another spring. That's a kindness, girl. More kindness than this country's ever shown you, I'd wager." And it was a kindness, of a kind. She knew that. He was not entirely wrong about any of it. The money would have set her up. The money would have meant warmth and food and walls that someone else had already built, somewhere the wind did not hunt. She thought about it. She would not pretend later that she had not. But she looked down at her own hands while she thought, at the calluses, at the mortar dried into the creases of her knuckles, at the dirt of the mountain ground so deep into them now that it would never fully wash out. This place was not worth money to her. It was worth more than money. It was the only thing in all the world that had her blood in it. "No," she said. Hartwell's jaw tightened. "It's a fair price." "It's a fair price for a piece of land," she agreed. "It's no price at all for the only home I've got." He stared at her a long moment, and whatever softness had brought the offer drained slowly out of him, and the hard thing underneath came back. "There's a property line runs near here," he said, quiet now. "Old survey. Bit of a question where it falls exactly. I'd hate to find out. Come spring, you'd been building on the wrong side of it." He let that sit. Things have a way of getting tangled for folks with no money to untangle them. It was not quite a threat. It was the cousin of one. The thing a powerful man says when he is offered to be generous and been refused, and wants you to remember, in the cold nights ahead, exactly how alone you are. She did not give him the fear he had come for. "Then I'd best build it strong," she said, "so it's worth fighting over." For just a moment, something almost like respect moved behind his eyes. He hated it. She could see that he hated it. He turned his horse and rode away, and she watched him go down the mountain, and she understood that she had made an enemy who would not forget her. A man who needed now for her to fail, who would carry her failure if it came, like a trophy. She went back to the wall. She built it stronger. But the mountain does not give a thing away for free. The first snow came earlier than it should have. She was hauling stone up the slope when she felt it. A change in the light first, then a single white flake drifting down past her face, almost gentle, almost lovely. She stopped, the wheelbarrow handles in her ruined hands, and watched it fall. It was beautiful. And it terrified her more than anything Royce Hartwell had ever said, because the snow was a clock. It was the slow hand of the thing that was coming for her, and it had just begun to move. Every flake that fell now was a flake that would not melt. Every white morning brought the killing winter one day closer to the door of a house that was not yet a house at all. She worked faster after that, harder. She drove her changed body past the place where it begged her to stop, and then past the place after that. She lined the earthen walls with the stones from the ruined cottage, fitting them one against another with a care she had learned from no one but the dead. She mixed her mortar from the clay of the slope and the sand of the creek, in the exact measures the journal gave, and when her first batch crumbled and her first wall slumped, she tore it down with her own hands and did it again and again. The mortar was its own long battle. Too much sand and it powdered away. Too much clay and it cracked as it dried. Fine lines spreading across a morning's work like the lines in old skin. She learned the feel of it the way the journal told her to, not by the measure, but by the hand. By the way, a good batch held its shape when she squeezed it and let it go. She ruined 3 days' worth of stone before her hands knew the difference, and then they knew. And after that, she did not have to think about it at all. Each stone laid was a small victory. Each wall that rose and stayed risen was a thing the world had said she could not do. And then came the morning, the slope let go. She had gone up before dawn, before even the gray light, because the clock was running, and she could not afford to lose an hour. She was working the upper part of the cut, loosening a shelf of frozen earth above the room, when she felt it. A shudder, a deep, low groan in the ground beneath her boots, the sound of a great deal of frozen earth deciding all at once that it had been disturbed enough. She did not think. There was no time to think. She threw herself sideways, hard, away from the cut, and the slope came down. A wall of frozen earth and loosened stone slid into the room she had spent weeks carving, in the space of 3 heartbeats, with a roar that the wind snatched away and carried off down the canyon. And then it was over. The dust settled. The mountain went quiet again, as if nothing had happened. As if it had not just buried half of everything she had built. She lay where she had thrown herself, her heart slamming against her ribs, her cheek pressed to the cold ground. And she looked at the wreckage of weeks of her life, and she felt the cold gray fog rise up so fast and so high that for one terrible moment she nearly let it take her. It would have been so easy to lie there, to let the snow come down and cover her and the half-buried room together, and make Royce Hartwell right, and make the man at the orphanage right, and make every closed door right. Forever. So very easy. But she had learned something in all those weeks of stone. She had learned that despair is a thing that wins only when you lie still for it. So she did not lie still. She got up. Her whole body shook, and not from the cold. She stood there in the gray dawn and looked at the slide, the ruin of the ruin, and she waited for the fog to tell her it was hopeless. And then she opened the journal with hands that would not quite stop trembling, because she did not know where else to turn. And the old woman was waiting for her there too. The mountain will take back what you build. Greta had written, in a passage the girl had read before and not understood. More than once, do not curse it when it does. It is not cruelty. It is only the mountain showing you where it is weak, so that you may build there stronger. Every wall I lost taught me where the next wall had to stand. The girl stood in the cold a long time with those words. And then, slowly, she understood. The slope had not come down by accident. It had come down because she had cut it too steep, too high, in her hurry against the snow. The mountain had not attacked her. It had corrected her. She picked up the shovel, and she began to clear the slide. Not in despair this time, in a kind of grim conversation with the rock. All right, she thought. Show me where it has to stand. And the mountain, in its slow and honest way, did. She rebuilt the cut shallower and braced it with timber, and the second time it held. After that, she did not rush the way she had. She had learned the difference between fast and hasty, and the mountain had been her teacher, and it did not teach gently. She lost more days to it than she could spare. The snow came again and stayed longer each time. The cold deepened. The light each day grew shorter, until it seemed the sun barely cleared the far ridge before it began to fall again. But the house began to come. Somewhere in the worst of it, Amos came up the mountain. She did not hear him until he was almost at the cut, and she came up out of the half-built room, expecting Hartwell, and found instead the old shopkeeper, red-faced from the climb, a sack over his shoulder. He did not say much. He was not a man who said much. He set the sack down. Inside was a side of salt pork and a tin of tea, and a pair of thick wool gloves with the price torn off. Stock that wasn't moving, he said gruffly, not meeting her eye. Be a waste, letting it sit. It was not stock that wasn't moving. They both knew it, but she had learned from him that some kindnesses have to be handed over sideways, dressed up as something else, or a proud person cannot take them. So she did not thank him in a way that would embarrass him. I'll add it to the line, she said. Pay you in spring. You'll pay me in spring, he agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved, and that was as close to a smile as Amos came. He stood a while and looked at the work, at the stone lung beginning to rise in the heart of the half-roofed room. He did not understand it. She could see that. But he had stopped expecting to find her dead. That was something. Crazy old woman built one of these, you say, he said. She did. He nodded slowly, taking it in. And it kept her warm. It's going to keep me warm, too, Marin said. Amos looked at her a long moment, this girl with the mountain ground into her hands, standing in the bones of a house no one in the valley believed in. You know, he said, I'm starting to think it might. And he went back down the mountain, and he had given her, again, the thing that was rarer than food up there in the cold. The sense that somewhere below, in the warm, cluttered dark of that store, one person was no longer counting the days until she died. The walls rose. The great granite shelf held the back of the room like a cupped hand, and in the center of it all, she built the thing the whole design lived and died upon. The stone lung. It was the hardest thing she had ever made. She built the firebox first from the precious fire bricks Amos had sold her on credit, setting each one with a care that bordered on prayer. The bricks were the one part she could not make herself, the one part that had to be bought and carried and could not be replaced if she ruined it. She set them slow. She set them twice. She set them until they were true. And then she began the maze. The long, winding passages of flat stone that would turn the heat back on itself, around and around, so the warmth could not escape up the chimney and into the night, but had to give itself up to the stone instead. It was like building a great puzzle in 3 dimensions, from the inside out, with no one to check her work but a dead woman's drawings. One stone set wrong, one passage too narrow or too wide, and the whole thing would not breathe. She tested each turn with a candle, the way the journal said, watching the small flame lean and pull, learning to read the way the air wanted to move before there was any fire at all to move it. There was a day, near the top of the chimney, when she had to lean her whole weight out over the unfinished stack to set the capstones, with nothing beneath her but the long fall to the canyon floor. Her hands shook with cold and exhaustion. One slip, and it would all be over, and not in the slow way of winter, but in a fast and final one. She set the stones anyway, one at a time, breathing slow, talking herself through it the way she imagined the old woman might have, all those years before, alone in the same high wind. She built it slowly. She tore parts of it down and built them again. Her back ached and her hands bled, and the cold tried every day to drive her indoors, and she did not let it. And bit by bit, the stone lung rose out of the floor of the buried room, a solid, silent column of stone in the heart of the house, a patient thing, waiting in the dark for the day someone would breathe fire into it and wake it up. She covered the room at last with a roof of scavenged timber, and over the timber she laid oilcloth, and over the oilcloth she laid sod and earth, layer on layer, until the house all but vanished back into the hillside, until you could stand 10 feet away and not know it was there at all. Until it had become, just as the old woman had dreamed, a part of the mountain itself. She stood back from it on the last day, in the failing light, and looked at the thing she had made. It was not grand. It was not the sort of house anyone in that town would have envied. From the outside, it was hardly a house at all. Just a low door, and a small, deep-set window, and a stone chimney set into a slope, half swallowed by the earth. But she knew what was in it. She knew the strength of the granite at its back. She knew the patient stone lung in its heart. She knew the warmth that waited deep in the mountain, the summer the earth still remembered. And she knew something else. She knew that her own blood was mixed into the mortar of those walls, that her own sweat had soaked into that earth, that every single stone of it had been lifted and carried and set in place by hands that had once been soft and were now as hard as the mountain. The world had handed her a pile of broken rock and called it fitting, and she had built herself a fortress. She was not anymore a victim of the thing that had happened to her. She was not the sad story. She was not the lesson. She was the one who had decided to begin, and then had not stopped. That was the evening the sky changed. She felt it before she saw it. A stillness fell over the land, sudden and complete, the way a room goes quiet when something terrible has walked into it. The wind, which had not stopped its howling in all the weeks she had been there, simply stopped. She straightened, her tools in her ruined hands, and she looked up, And the sky, away to the north, over the high, pale shoulders of the mountains, had begun to turn, not gray, not the slate of the ordinary cold mornings. It was deepening to a color she had no name for, a bruised, heavy purple, spreading slow across the heavens like something rising up from beneath them. The light went strange and thin. The air grew thick and achingly cold, and tasted of iron. Far below her, in the town that had already buried her, she could not see it. But she knew the old-timers there were stepping out onto their porches one by one, and looking up at that bruised and swelling sky, and going very still. She knew that down in his great house, Royce Hartwell was looking up at it too. And she knew, with the same cold certainty she had felt the day she opened the tin box, exactly what that color meant. The thing that had been coming for her since the day the last door closed was almost here. She did not feel afraid. She had bled for this. She had been buried and had dug herself back out. She had built a house out of a mountain with her own 2 hands and a dead woman's faith. She looked up at the bruised and waiting sky a moment longer. Then she turned and went down into her house in the earth to wait for the winter to come and test everything she had become. The thing that came down out of the north did not behave like weather. Weather has mercy in it somewhere. Weather passes. But what gathered over those mountains in that bruised and swelling sky had the patience of something that meant to stay. The old-timers in the town had a name for it. They said it only in low voices, on porches, with their eyes turned up to the dark. They called it the White Death. And they said it came only once in a long, long while to remind the living who truly owned that country. By the time the first of it reached the town, the people had done all they knew to do. They had sealed their windows with rags and tar paper. They had piled wood high against their doors. They had filled every lamp and counted every match and gathered their families close into single rooms, the way frightened people draw together toward whatever light they have left. And they had, every one of them, thought about the girl on the ridge. Some thought of her with pity. A few, the kinder ones, with a quiet ache they could not name. But most thought of her the way a person thinks of a thing already lost. A sad story they would tell, come spring, when the snow gave her back. Down in his great house, Royce Hartwell was not afraid. His house was the largest in all that country. It had wide windows that looked out over land he owned as far as the eye could carry. It had a furnace in its belly, a great roaring modern thing, and a generator to feed it, and tanks of fuel enough to outlast any winter that had ever dared to come. He had built his life on the simple, certain faith that a man with enough could not be touched. Enough land, enough money, enough fuel to burn back any darkness that came knocking. And so, as the sky turned to bruise and iron, he stood at his wide window with a glass in his hand, and he looked up the mountain toward the ridge he could not quite see, and he smiled. "She'll be gone by morning," he said. He said it to his wife, who sat close to the fire and did not answer. He said it, in the days that followed, to anyone who would listen. He took a strange comfort in it. The girl's ending had become a thing he needed to be true, because if a foolish orphan in a hole in the ground could die in this storm, then it proved what he had always believed. That survival was a matter of strength, of force, of having enough and burning it. That the way to beat the cold was to outmuscle it. He did not know yet how badly he had misunderstood the thing that was coming. Up on the ridge, the girl felt the storm arrive in her chest before she heard it. A pressure, a heaviness in the air. The whole world holding one long breath. She did not panic. There was nothing left to do in a panic, and she knew it because the work was already done. Her preparations were not piled against a door. They were not stacked in a woodshed. They were built into the very bones of the house, laid stone by stone over all those bleeding weeks. She did the last small things in the strange purple twilight. She fixed the heavy shutter over the deep-set window. She banked snow high against the cold north wall, the way the journal said, to wrap the house in one more blanket against the dark. And then she went inside. She pulled the heavy door shut behind her. The salvaged door, the only thing left whole from the old cottage, fitted now into a frame she had built true. It closed with a deep, solid sound, and the howling of the wind dropped at once to a far-off murmur, like a voice on the other side of the world. The air inside was cool and still and clean. It smelled of earth and stone and the clay of her own curing mortar. There were no drafts. There was nothing of the desperate, leaking cold that crept through the wooden houses in the valley below. There was only the deep quiet of the inside of a mountain. And in the heart of the room, the stone lung, waiting. She knelt before the firebox, and she opened the journal one last time before the storm took the world. She did not need it. She knew the words by heart now, but she wanted the old woman near for this, for the waking of the thing they had built across all those years between them. Do not feed it the way the foolish feed a fire, Greta had written. They burn slow and steady all the day and lose it all up the chimney into the night. That is fear, not warmth. Burn it once, burn it hot. Burn it fast and clean and bright, and then close it and trust the stone. The stone will not betray you. The stone remembers everything you give it. The girl built her fire small and tight and exact. She struck the match. The flame caught, and in the close space of the firebox, the small fire did not merely burn. It roared, fierce and white and hungry, exactly as the old woman had promised, throwing a furious heat into the maze of stone. She fed it for 2 hours, no more. A short, furious, blazing breath of fire, while the stone drank the heat in deep, all through its winding passages, storing it the way the granite stored the summer. And then, as the first true fury of the storm struck the heavy door like a fist, she sealed it. She closed the firebox, she shut the damper in the chimney, and she trapped every last bit of that fierce heat inside the stone, with nowhere left to go but slowly, patiently, back out into the room. Then she sat down at her small handmade table, and she waited. The storm came down on the mountain like a living thing. It was not snow the way snow is in gentler places. It did not fall. It was driven, sideways and screaming, in a solid white wall that swallowed the world whole. The canyon vanished. The ridge vanished. The very memory of the land was buried under it. The wind did not howl. It shrieked. A high, endless, tearing sound that clawed at the souls of every living thing caught out beneath it, that found the smallest gap in any wall and drove its cold fingers through. It buried fences to their tops. It swallowed the road. It piled itself into great curling drifts taller than a man. and then it kept on coming. And in the valley below, the fight began. In Royce Hartwell's great house, the first thing to fail was his certainty. His furnace roared. It ran without rest, a great hungry beast in the belly of the house, burning fuel as fast as it could draw it. And still, somehow, the cold came in. It seeped around the wide and beautiful windows he had been so proud of. It crept up through the floors. It found him no matter where he stood, a thin and patient cold that the roaring furnace could not seem to push back. The number on the wall began to fall. He stared at it. This man who had never lost a thing in his life he could buy his way out of, and he watched it drop. 1 degree, then another. His wife pulled the blankets higher and said nothing, and her silence was worse than any words. And then the generator began to cough. The fuel in that terrible cold had begun to thicken in its lines. The great machine that fed his house, its light and its warmth, sputtered and caught and sputtered again, like something struggling to breathe. Hartwell went to it. He worked over it in the dark with hands that shook, and he could not say whether they shook from the cold or from the first true fear he had felt in a great many years. He got it running. For a while, he piled logs into the wide stone fireplace in his great room, log after log, building a roaring blaze that he stood before with his hands out, sure it would save him. But a fire like that gives most of its heat straight up the chimney. It is a beautiful thing, and a hungry one, and it warms the air a foot in front of it and lets the rest of the house go cold. He was feeding the storm, sending his warmth up the flue as an offering to the very thing that was trying to kill him. His house was a great and beautiful ship, and it was taking on cold the way a holed ship takes on water. And slowly, hour by hour, the cold was winning. Down the valley, it was no better. In a small frame house not far from the store, a young mother sat up the whole first night with her child wrapped against her chest, feeding the iron stove one precious log at a time, watching the woodpile shrink and doing the arithmetic that every family in that valley was doing in the dark. How many logs, how many hours, how many nights, and what came after the last log was gone? They were not careless people. They were not foolish. They had done everything the way it had always been done, the way their parents had done it, and it was not going to be enough. The old way was a battle, and the cold was winning that battle in every wooden house in the valley at once. Up on the ridge, in the house dug into the earth, there was no fight at all. There was only silence. The shriek of the storm reached the girl as a far, soft murmur, muffled to almost nothing by the earth and the stone all around her. The fury of the white death raged a few feet over her head, and it could not get in. It clawed at the hillside and found no door it could open. It screamed at a house that simply did not answer. And then, slowly, the warmth came. Not as a blast, not as the dry, scorching heat of Hartwell's roaring furnace. It came the way dawn comes, slow, even, everywhere at once. The great stone lung, its surface warm now to the touch, began to breathe. It gave back the heat it had drunk in those 2 furious hours, a little at a time, with the patience of stone, and the warmth spread out into the small room and seemed to soak into the girl's very bones. It was a soft heat, a living heat, The kind of warmth you feel sitting in the sun on the first true day of spring. The cold in the room gave way before it, and the air did not go stale or thick, the way air does in a sealed place, because deep in the granite wall behind her, the narrow fissure breathed its own slow breath, that faint and steady current out of the heart of the mountain, turning the air over gently, keeping it fresh and clean. She lit a single candle. Its small flame stood straight and unwavering in the still air. And she understood, watching it, that she had crossed over some line she had not seen coming. She was not surviving anymore. She was living. She made herself a small supper of stew on an iron plate she set on the warm surface of the stone, and the smell of it filled the little room. She ate it slowly at her own handmade table by the light of her own candle. Above her, the white death raged on, burying the world, breaking the strong, finding the gaps in every proud and roaring house in the valley below. And she sat in the warm heart of the mountain, fed and safe and unafraid, a single steady heartbeat of warmth in the chest of a frozen world. She thought of the old woman then, of Greta, who had sat in this same place, perhaps, on some long ago night of storm, and listened to the same far murmur, and felt the same impossible warmth at her back. A widow, alone at the edge of the world, who had built her safety out of patience and stone, and then written it all down for a girl she would never meet. The earth remembers the summer, the girl thought, and for the first time, she did not just believe it. She felt it. She read by the candle a long while, turning the worn pages, drinking in more of the old woman's quiet wisdom. And then she banked herself down into her blankets, in the warmth, and she slept, deep and dreamless and unafraid, while the worst the mountain had to give howled itself out a few feet over her head. She woke once in the night to feed the stone its single breath of fire for the coming day. A few small logs, a short, fierce burn, then sealed again. Her stack of firewood, the small stack Hartwell had laughed at, the one he had said would not last a week, had barely been touched. The stove did the work. The mountain did the work. She had only had to listen. For 2 days and 2 nights, the White Death raged. And in the valley, those 2 days became a long, slow war of cold and dwindling fire. Families huddled in single rooms, feeding their hungry iron stoves with wood piles that shrank too fast. The pipes froze and split. And then the fragile thread that carried light and power through the valley snapped somewhere out in the storm, and the whole town fell into a deep and frozen dark. In Hartwell's great house, the end came on the second night. His generator, fighting its thickened fuel, gave one last shuddering cough, and died. And it did not start again. The lights went out. The great furnace fell silent. The roaring beast in the belly of the house simply stopped. And in the sudden quiet, Royce Hartwell could hear, for the first time, exactly how loud the cold truly was. His grand house became a beautiful icebox. He and his wife wrapped themselves in every blanket they owned and sat together in the dark, listening to the timbers groan and crack in the terrible cold. He had logs left. He fed his useless fireplace and watched the warmth fly up the chimney, and he understood, slowly, in the long shivering hours, that all of it had been wrong. His money could not warm him. His land could not warm him. His enough had not been enough. The cold did not care what a man owned. It only cared what a man understood. And out in the dark, in a hole in the ground he had laughed at, a girl with nothing understood something he had spent his whole life too proud to learn. On the third morning, the wind died. It did not fade. It stopped all at once, the way it had begun, and the silence that fell behind it was so vast and so complete that it had a weight of its own, a great muffled stillness, heavier than all the noise that had come before it. The girl opened her door onto a world made new. A thick and blinding blanket of white lay over everything, carved by the wind into great frozen waves and dunes. The sky above was a hard, searing, painful blue. The air was so cold it cut at her lungs like glass, and so clean it almost hurt to breathe. And from her stone chimney, for the short while her morning fire burned, a thin ribbon of smoke rose straight up into that blue. The only living thing, it seemed, on the whole white face of the mountain. But the stove did not need the fire for long. By the time the sun was full up over the far ridge, the brief burn had done its work, and the chimney had gone still, and nothing at all showed above the buried house. Nothing a man climbing the mountain would ever take for a sign of life. Down in the valley, Royce Hartwell crawled out of his frozen house gray-faced and shaking, his pride lying somewhere behind him in the dark and the cold. But something else had taken root in him during those long, shivering nights. Something darker than fear. He needed to see her. He needed it the way a drowning man needs air. Because if the girl on the ridge was dead, as he had sworn she would be, then he had been right after all. Then the storm had only proven what he had always believed, and his own freezing house was just bad luck, just a broken machine, and not the failure of everything he was. But if she was dead, he had to see it with his own eyes. He needed her ending to paper over the great cracks the storm had opened in him. It was a cruel thing to want. He knew it was. And he wanted it anyway, with a desperate, shameful hunger. So he wrapped himself in the best gear he owned, and he set out up the mountain. The snow was waist deep in places, and worse. The trek that a horse could have walked in 20 minutes on a clear day took him more than 2 hours of brutal, gasping struggle, breaking trail through drifts that swallowed him to the chest. The cold tore at him. His breath came ragged and white. More than once he thought of turning back, but the need drove him on, up and up toward the ridge. And at last he crested the final rise, half frozen and shaking with exhaustion. And he looked down at her dwelling. It was almost gone. Buried near to the roofline in the great white drifts, only the top of the door and the stone chimney showing above the snow. It looked like a grave. It looked exactly like the grave he had told her she was digging. And there was no smoke. In the still cold air, above that buried house, he saw no thin ribbon rising, no sign of a fire, no sign of anything at all. What he could not know, what no proud man who had never once stopped to learn could know, was that a stove like hers does not smoke through the day. It breathes one short breath of fire at dawn, and then holds its warmth in silence for a day and a night. The very stillness he was reading as death was the quiet proof of the thing working exactly as it should. But he did not know that, and so his frozen heart gave a grim and shameful leap. The fire had gone out. She was dead. He had been right. He stumbled the last yards down the slope, half falling, his mind already turning to the somber speech he would carry back to town. The sad, knowing words. I warned her. I told them all. He reached the buried door. He braced himself for the cold and the silence and the still shape he would find inside. He pushed the heavy door open, and a wall of warmth came out to meet him. It struck him like something solid, not the dry, scorching blast of an overworked furnace. A deep, soft, living warmth, as though the very air inside that buried house were alive and breathing. It rolled out over him, over his frozen face and his shaking hands, and the shock of it was so total that for a moment the whole white world spun, and he had to catch himself against the door frame. He staggered inside, into the dim gold light of a single candle, his eyes struggling to make sense of what they saw. And he saw her, the girl, Maren, sitting calmly at her small table, a needle in her hand, quietly mending a tear in her coat, a mug of something steaming gently at her elbow. She was not dead. She was not even cold. She was warm and rested and entirely at her ease in a small bright room that was as snug and as gentle as a summer evening, while a few feet away the white death had buried the whole world in ice. He stared at the great column of stone in the heart of the room, radiating its soft and steady warmth into every corner. He could not understand it. It broke every rule of survival he had ever known. It defied everything he had built his whole proud life upon. "How?" he said. It came out of him as a cracked and broken whisper, the voice of a man whose entire understanding of the world had just come down around him like a slope of frozen earth. "How?" The girl looked up at him, and there was no triumph in her face. That was the thing he would remember longest after. She did not look at him the way a winner looks at the loser. She looked at him only the way you look at a man who has come in out of a terrible cold. She saw him plainly. Not the rich man. Not the man on the fine horse who had told her she would die. Just a man, stripped bare by the mountain, his certainty frozen out of him, shaking in her doorway. "The stove," she said, quietly, in the warm stillness. "It holds the heat of one hot fire in its stone, and it gives it back, slow, for a whole day. That's all." She set down her needle. She nodded toward the granite wall at her back. "And the earth keeps the rest. It holds the summer deep inside, where the cold can't reach it." She picked up her mug. She held it in both hands, in those hard and leathered hands, and she looked at him over the steam of it. "My great-grandmother didn't fight the cold," she said. "She made a friend of the warmth." The words were so simple, so plain, and so quiet, and so completely without cruelty, that they landed on him harder than any blow could have. He had spent his whole life trying to conquer the winter, to outmuscle it, to burn enough and own enough and force the cold to yield. And this girl, this orphan he had laughed at, had simply stepped out of its way. He had nothing to say to that. There was nothing in him left to say it with. And it was just then, in that silence, that a second figure filled the low doorway, covered head to foot in snow, his face gray and drawn with worry, his chest heaving from the long climb. Amos. The old man had come up the mountain through the same deep drifts, fearing the worst, certain he would find the girl frozen, and the kindness he had shown her come to nothing. He stopped dead in the doorway. and he took in the whole impossible scene at once: the warmth, the candlelight, the girl alive and well and steady at her table, and the great Royce Hartwell, the man who owned half the country, shivering and broken and speechless in the middle of a hole in the ground that he had sworn would be a grave. The old man's eyes went wide, and then, slowly, something moved across his tired face that was not quite a smile, but was something deeper than one. No one said a word. There was no need. The story told itself there in the warm gold light more completely than any words ever could. The proud man, humbled, the forgotten girl, alive, and the quiet, patient wisdom of a woman long dead, breathing warmth into the heart of a frozen world, exactly as she had promised it would. Royce Hartwell's defeat was complete. It was silent. And at last, it was witnessed. The snow gave the story back to the valley slowly, the way the snow gives back everything in its own time. But a story like that cannot be buried for long. It began in low voices, in the warm corner of the store, where men and women who had nearly frozen in their own proud houses gathered to thaw and to talk. It passed from one to the next, growing as it went, the way the best and truest stories always do. The great Royce Hartwell, found half frozen and humbled in the very grave he had dug for a girl with his words. The orphan no one had wanted, alive and warm in a hole in the ground that should have killed her by the first snow. It was a tale too rich, too perfect in its turning, to ever be hushed up. And so it was not. By the time the roads cleared, there was not a soul in that country who had not heard it. And the town held its breath, because everyone knew what a man like Hartwell did when he was made small in front of the whole valley. They had felt the weight of his land and his money for years. They had not forgotten the way he could tangle a poor family in a property line, or call in a debt at the cruelest possible moment. They waited in those first thawing days for the other thing to fall, for him to find some quiet revenge on the girl who had unmade him, to drive her off her ridge and out of sight, so that no one would ever have to look at the living proof of his failure. They waited for him to turn cruel. It was the most natural thing in the world to expect. And it was not what happened. A thing happened to Royce Hartwell in the weeks after the storm that no one could have predicted, least of all him, because something had broken in him up on that mountain. And it was not only his pride, it was the wall, the hard wall a man builds around himself when he decides early that the world is a thing to be beaten, and that everyone in it is either above him or beneath him, and that warmth is weakness, and that the only safety lies in having more than the next man. That wall had cracked in a girl's doorway, in a flood of impossible warmth he could not explain. And through the crack, something got in. He went back up the mountain, not many days after, alone, on foot, the way he had gone the first time, breaking trail through the snow. The girl saw him coming from a long way off, a dark figure laboring up the white slope, and she set down her work and waited at her door. She did not know what he wanted, and she had every reason in the world to fear it. The offer, the property line, the threat dressed up as concern. He stopped a few feet from her. He was breathing hard, and for a long moment he could not seem to find the words at all. "I told them you would die," he said at last. It was not what she had expected. I told the whole town. I wanted it to be true. His voice was rough and low, and it shook in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I came up here that morning to see your body, so I could go down and tell them all I'd been right. He looked at her, this proud man, with eyes that had nowhere left to hide. That is the kind of man I have been. The girl said nothing. She let him stand in it, not cruelly. She only understood, the way she had come to understand the mountain, that some things a person has to say all the way to the end, with no one rushing them through it. You had every reason, he went on, to shut that door on me, the way the whole world has shut its doors on you. I offered to buy you off this rock. I threatened you over a line on an old map, and then I climbed up here, hoping to find you frozen. He shook his head, slow, and you opened your door, and you gave me tea, and you warmed my hands. I would not have done it. If I'd been you, I would not have done it. He stopped. You did. And there it was. The thing that had broken the wall. Not her survival. Not even her being right where he had been so completely wrong. He could have lived with being wrong. Men live with that. What he could not live with was that the girl he had tried to drive off the mountain had looked up from her table, seen a frozen man in her doorway, and given him warmth. She had not gloated. She had not made him beg. She had simply explained the thing he had been too proud to understand his whole life, and then let him stand by her fire until he could feel his hands again. She had shown him a kind of strength he did not have a name for. The strength it takes to be kind to the very person who wished you gone. I don't know how to ask for what I came up here to ask for, he said. I'm not sure there's a word for it. The girl looked at him a long moment, and then she stepped back from her door and held it open, and the warmth rolled out past her into the cold. There's tea, she said. Come in out of the cold. He came in, and the proud man sat down at the small handmade table of the girl he had scorned, and she poured him tea. And for a long while, neither of them said much of anything at all. He looked at the great stone lung in the heart of the room, at the warmth it breathed, at the fissure in the granite, and the snug earthen walls, and the whole impossible, gentle miracle of the place. The old woman, he said finally. Your great-grandmother, the one everyone called crazy. He shook his head slowly. She wasn't crazy at all, was she? No, the girl said. She was just quiet. And quiet's easy to mistake for foolish, if you're loud enough yourself. Hartwell flinched at that, just slightly, but he did not look away. I thought the loudest voice in any room was the one that was right, he said. I built my whole life on it. The girl turned her mug slowly in her hands. There was no edge in her voice when she answered. Only a kind of plain, hard-won understanding. So did everyone who ever taught me anything, she said, right up until I came to a place where the loud ones freeze and the quiet ones live. He had no answer for that. He did not need one. The warmth said everything that was left to say. He did not leave that country. The town had been so sure he would. So sure he would sell his great cold house and his land and disappear, unable to bear the sight of the girl who had unmade him. But a man who has truly changed does not run from the place that changed him. He stayed, and over that long winter and the spring that came after it, the people of the valley watched Royce Hartwell become someone they did not recognize. The hardness went out of him. The terrible certainty that had crushed everyone around him for so many years simply wasn't there anymore. In its place was something quieter, something that paid attention. He forgave the debts that had hung over hard families for years, the ones he had once held over them like weather. And when a man who had lost half his woodpile to the storm came to his door, ashamed, with his hat in his hands, Hartwell filled the man's wagon and would not take a cent. It was as though the warmth he had felt in that doorway had gotten inside him, and he had decided, late in his life, to learn at last how to give it back. The town did not entirely trust it. Not at first. Old fear dies slow. But warmth, given long enough and freely enough, has a way of melting even that. The wife who had shivered beside him in the dark of that storm lived to see all of it. She said, later, that she had gotten back a husband she had long ago stopped hoping for, that the cold had taken something out of him on that mountain, and that what came back to fill the empty space was a far better man than the one who had gone up. The girl, for her part, became something she had never once asked to be. She became the keeper of the warmth. The people who had pitied her, or laughed at her, or buried her in their minds before the first snow even fell, began to climb the ridge to her door. Not with scorn now, with questions, with a new and humbled curiosity. They had nearly frozen in their own homes while a girl with nothing sat warm in a hole in the ground, and they wanted, desperately, to understand how. She had never wanted followers. She had only ever wanted to survive. But she could not turn them away. She knew, better than anyone alive, what it was to be cold, with no one to teach you better. So she brought out the old woman's journal. She spread its worn pages on her small table, and she showed her neighbors the diagrams she had bled to understand. The warmth that hides deep in stone. The fire you burn hot and fast and then trust. The slow, patient breath of the earth, and the summer the ground never forgets. She taught them why their hungry iron stoves, that ate wood all day and warmed only the air, were a battle they could never win against a real winter. And she taught them, without ever quite saying so, the one thing the old woman had spent her whole life trying to say, that the land was not their enemy, that it had been offering them the same honest bargain all along, and that all it had ever asked was to be met halfway. The first to truly try it was the young mother from the house near the store. The one who had sat up the whole first night of the storm with her child against her chest, watching the woodpile shrink. She came up the ridge in the spring, shy and stubborn at once, and she said she did not want her children to ever be that cold again. And she asked Marin to show her how. So Marin showed her. They built it together over that summer, the two of them and the woman's husband, and before long, half the neighbors, who came first to watch and stayed to lift. It was rough work, and the first stove they built did not draw right, and they had to take the whole flue apart and set it again, the way Marin had taken hers apart, the way Greta had taken hers apart, the long line of women learning the same lesson from the same patient stone. But by the time the cold came around again, that family had a great quiet heart of stone in the middle of their house, and they burned a fraction of the wood they once had, and they slept through the long nights without fear. Word of that traveled too. The next summer there were more hands digging, and the summer after that, more still, until the houses of the valley began, one by one, to change their very shape, sinking closer to the earth, growing those slow stone hearts, giving up the long losing war against the winter for something gentler and far more sure. And Royce Hartwell was among the first to tear out his great useless furnace and build a stone lung in its place, with his own two soft hands, under the patient instruction of the girl he had once told would freeze by morning. He was not good at it. He bruised his fingers. He set stones wrong and had to pull them out again. He was, for the first time in his long life, a beginner at something. But he did not quit. And when at last it breathed its first slow warmth into his great house, the town said he wept, a proud man weeping over a fire he had built himself. No one ever teased him for it. They understood. It was the healing of more than houses. The girl who had arrived at the end of that road with nothing, who had been so alone that the loneliness had nearly become a stone she sank beneath, was not alone anymore. It had crept up on her so slowly, she almost missed it. There was Amos, who had given her a chance when no one else would, and who now sat at her table some evenings and told her the old stories of the valley, the way a man tells stories to family. He was the nearest thing to a grandfather she had ever known, and neither of them ever said so, because some things do not need saying to be true. And there were the children. They had begun, somewhere along the way, to climb the ridge just to see her. They were not afraid of the strange girl in the hill anymore. They thought she was something close to magic. They would sit at her hearth and beg her for the story of the great storm and the proud man in the doorway, and she would tell it and leave out the cruel parts because they were children, and there was time enough for the cruel parts later. They left small things at her door, sometimes, on their way back down. A loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, a pair of warm wool socks knitted by hands she had warmed. She had not had a family. The world had made very sure of that. And so she had built one, out of a mountain and a dead woman's wisdom and the slow, patient warmth that draws cold people in toward whatever light there is. The girl who had been told she was no one's problem had become, somehow, everyone's, and it was the best thing that had ever happened to her. There was a day, late that following autumn, when she understood how far she had come. The first frost had silvered the slope. She was carrying water up from the creek the way she had 1,000 times, and she stopped, the way you stop sometimes when a thing catches you off guard, because there was smoke. Not one thin ribbon now. Not the single lonely thread that had marked her house against the snow on the morning Hartwell climbed the ridge to find her dead. There were many, all down the valley, rising into the cold blue evening, ribbon after ribbon of wood smoke, each one a stone lung breathing, each one a family warm, each one a small patient fire that would burn hot and bright, and then trust the stone to hold it through the night. She stood there in the frost with the water cooling in her hands, and she looked at all that rising smoke, and something in her chest came loose that had been clenched tight since the day a door first closed behind her. She thought of the old woman, of Greta, who had died alone on this rock, with no one to teach, no one to leave her wisdom to but a granddaughter's granddaughter she would never live to meet. The old woman had built one warm house, and then she had sealed everything she knew in tin and wax, and trusted it to the dark, and to time, and to the faint hope that someday Someone would dig. She had never gotten to see this. All these fires, all this warmth, a whole valley that had learned at last to live with the winter instead of dying against it. The girl had thought, that first terrible day, that she was inheriting a ruin. She understood now that she had inherited a promise, and that she had kept it, not just for herself, for all of them, for the old woman who never got to see the smoke. She lifted her hand slowly toward the valley full of fires. It was not quite a wave. There was no one down there to wave to, not really. It was more like a passing on, a message sent down the same long line of years the old woman had once sent the journal down. "You were right," she said softly, "to a woman long gone into the ground. They're warm, all of them. You were right." And the smoke rose, and the cold came down, and the valley breathed its many slow, warm breaths into the dark. The seasons turned, as seasons do. The girl grew older on her ridge. The years pressed their soft marks into her face, the way years do to a face that has been out in the weather and has laughed and has wept and has lived. She never left. She could have. In time, with the respect she had earned and the skill in her hands, she could have gone anywhere, built anything, lived an easier life in a gentler place. People urged her to, sometimes. She had paid her debt to that hard country and more, they said. She had earned softer ground, but she only smiled and shook her head. She had learned the difference on the very first day, on cold stone steps, with a suitcase in her hand. A shelter only keeps you. A home keeps you, and is kept by you. She had spent 18 years in the first kind. She was not about to walk away from the only one of the second kind she had ever known. Royce Hartwell went before her, in the end, as the old go. He died an old man, in a warm house he had built with his own hands, with his wife beside him and the people of the valley near. People who had, against all the odds of who he had once been, come to love him. And he asked, near the end, that the girl be told one thing, that the warmest he had ever been in all his long life was not in his great house, with all its fuel and all its fire. It was in a hole in the ground, in a doorway, on the worst morning of his life, when a girl he had tried to drive off her own mountain had looked up from her table and said, "Come in, out of the cold." The girl, no longer a girl, sat by her stone lung the night they brought her the message, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she nodded, slowly, and there were no hard feelings left in her at all. They had melted long ago in the same warmth that had melted his. He learned how to listen, she said. Late, but he learned. She looked into the soft glow of her fire. That's more than most people manage in a whole long life. It was, she thought, the truest kind of forgiveness there is. Not forgetting. She would never forget the man on the horse who had told her she would die, but holding both things at once, the man he had been and the man he had become, and choosing freely to warm her hands at the memory of the second one. In time she grew truly old. Her hands, which had once been soft and then ruined, and then hard as the mountain, grew soft again in a different way, the way old hands do, worn smooth, gentle, hands that had carried a great deal and set most of it down. And on the soft evenings, she would sit outside her door, wrapped in a good warm blanket now, not a thin one, and she would watch the children. Not the children she had first taught, their children, and before the end, their children's children. A whole generation that had grown up in warm houses sunk close to the earth. A generation that did not lie awake in the long nights listening to the cold try the doors. A generation that, when the great storms came down out of the north, no longer huddled in fear, but slept. They did not know to be amazed by it. That was the most wonderful part. To them, warmth in winter was simply how the world was. They could not imagine it any other way. They would never know the terror of that first morning, or the man on the horse, or the girl who had nearly let the cold take her on a flat, cold stone before a single purple wildflower changed her mind. They only knew that they were warm and safe, and that they belonged to a place that belonged to them, which was, when you came right down to it, the only thing the old woman had ever wanted, the only thing the girl had ever wanted either, to be cold and then to be warm, to be alone and then to belong, to be handed a ruin and to turn it with patience and with stubbornness and with love into a home. There was a child once, near the very end, who climbed the ridge to sit with her. A small one, bundled against the cold, full of questions, the way the best children always are. The child looked at the old woman, and at the low house half sunk in the hill, and at the thin ribbon of smoke rising up from the stone chimney into the wide and ancient sky. "Were you really all alone up here?" the child asked. "At the start? With nobody at all?" The old woman was quiet for a moment. She looked out over the valley, at all the rising smoke, at all the warm houses huddled gently against the dark, at the whole long story that had grown out of one girl and one journal and one stubborn refusal to lie down in the cold. And then she smiled. "For a little while," she said. "I thought so." She reached out and tucked the blanket a little closer around the child's shoulders. "But it turns out, I never was. Not really." She looked up at the smoke, rising and rising into the gold. "Somebody had been thinking of me a long, long time before I ever got here. I just hadn't dug deep enough yet to find her." The child did not fully understand, but the child understood enough. The child leaned in against the old woman's side in the warmth that came up out of the earth and the stone, and the two of them sat together as the evening came down soft and blue over the valley. And from every house below, the smoke rose, warm, patient, unafraid, a whole world of small fires. That one girl, and one old woman before her, had finally taught how to breathe.